Kia ora, hello, and welcome to the Pearl of the Islands Foundation three-part webinar series on Christian-Muslim relations with Professor Douglas Pratt. This series will be uploaded to Pearl of the Islands Foundation YouTube website for later viewing, so feel free to share that with your friends and family. We are now up to week 2 of Christian-Muslim relations. Last week, Professor Pratt covered history of Christian-Muslim relations, and like I said, you could see that on YouTube. Today, he'll be talking about Christian-Muslim relations in contemporary society. I might just quickly introduce Professor Douglas Pratt for those of you who are joining us for the first time. Professor Douglas Pratt taught religious studies at the University of Waikato for over 30 years, retiring mid-2018. Following the disestablishment of the religious studies program, currently he holds appointments as honorary professor in the theological and religious studies program of the University of Auckland, and is adjunct professor of theology and interreligious relations in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Bern, Switzerland. He recently was elected a fellow of both the Royal Historical Society and of the Royal Asiatic Society. His research interests include Christian-Muslim relations, interfaith dialogue, and contemporary issues in religion, and he is also the chief editor of a major volume of thematic essays in Christian-Muslim relations, a bibliographical history series. Professor Douglas Pratt, so nice to see you. Welcome back.
Kia ora, thank you, and salam alaikum to all my Muslim friends and colleagues, and greetings to you all, particularly in this month of the fasting month of Ramadan.
Alaikum salam. Thank you very much. I hope your week has been well.
Yes. We are, of course, still in lockdown circumstances here in New Zealand, what we call level 3. It has allowed me to go out to the supermarket, but I remain home pretty well most of the time.
Oh, that's fantastic. We're really looking forward to today's presentation, looking at Christian-Muslim relations in contemporary society, and particularly want to take away a lot of messages on how to apply relationship building in today's context. So I'm looking forward to that. But before I do, I just wanted to let our viewers know that they could ask a question at the chat section. So feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation, where we will direct it to Professor Douglas Pratt. Professor Douglas Pratt, Christian-Muslim relations in contemporary society. Over to you.
Thank you. We'll just get this going. So in looking at the contemporary society issue, it's really, I'm continuing on from last week with the historical trajectory, bringing it into the contemporary situation by looking at some significant developments that have taken place. But just to backtrack a little bit from what we talked about last week in terms of history, and discerning from that history dynamics of relationship. And out of it, I want to highlight three fundamental dynamics that we see through history, and certainly are very much active today, shall we say. There's mutual antipathy. We see that in situations where each religion, or either religions, views the other in some kind of competitive modality, sometimes negatively in terms of heresy or apostasy or whatever. That's the antipathy side, and we see that expressed from in different quarters. But also there's mutual affinity. Negativity is not by no means the only dynamic, of course. And here we see threads of respect where, for example, Muslims have referred from the beginning to Christians as peoples of the book. And Christians are challenged and have in many cases responded positively by regarding Muslims as co-religionists. This thread of respect, I think, is the underlying dynamic that needs to be picked up and reinforced today. Certainly in the early Islamic empires, we see affinity coming about because the empires required Christians and Jews in order to function in the administrations and so on. And over time, there's been a variety of examples of intercommunal harmony. But the third dynamic is important also, mutual inquiry. It begins in the days of soon after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, with interest from both Christians and Muslims in his pre-prophethood travels, what that meant, what he learned, how that fed into the development of the faith and the culture around it. Then again, the golden centuries of Muslim-ruled Spain was apex point in terms of dialogue between the three religions, particularly with the work of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars, recovering the classical heritage that had been lost to Europe through its own dark ages. And since the mid-20th century, new dialogical willingness has been expressed and given evidence on both sides. Christians and Muslims have joined together in so many contexts. But when we think of the modern contemporary world, we need to actually take account of some key markers. We think of it really, the modern or the contemporary era, beginning with the Great War, the war that began in 1914, World War I. It's often referred to as marking the end of what's called the long 19th century, which is the end point for the bibliographical history project that we referred to. But it's also significantly the marker of the ending, or the beginning of the ending, of the last great empires of Islam and of Christianity. Of course, the Islamic context was the Ottoman Caliphate, which concluded in the early 1920s, but the beginning of its ending was very much World War I and its involvement. And of course, at the same time, in terms of Western Christendom, World War I marks the beginnings of the end of the British Empire, the German Reich, and other European type of empires, colonial empires. Things began to change. In the East, Eastern Christendom, the great empire, the great Russian Orthodox Empire, the empire of the Tsars, also came to an ending point around this time with the revolution and the ushering in of communism. Which brings me to this next factor, that the era we're talking about began in the early part of the 20th century, the 1910s, 20s, and so on, with the rise of fascism, communism, and atheist secularism. This posed all sorts of new challenges to peoples of faith. It was an era of pretenders, contenders, and popularists during the 1920s and 1930s. One can only wonder if we're not repeating that today. But in this context, there were what could be called countervailing ecumenisms. And ecumenism means really the coming together across borders, the seeing of the world in some kind of whole. In the religious context, from the Christian side, there were movements called Life and Work and Faith and Order and the International Missionary Council, all of whom were seeking to work across old borders and marker lines within that faith, and that produced in the end the World Council of Churches. In the political context, the early 20th century saw the rise of the League of Nations as an attempt to try and bring nations together under an umbrella, and that resulted in the end with the United Nations. And the last marker, key marker, is of course the rise of the phenomenon of globalization and the end of what we might call homogeneity. That is the end of a sense of national identity being geographic to being culturally defined, of societies moving from social uniformity to social diversity. All these sorts of factors play a part in the context into which the question of Christian-Muslim engagement and dialogue comes to play. As I've said, this is a context of affinity and inquiry struggling with inherent tendency to antipathy. That's the struggle, the tendency to antipathy, which comes about with certain forms of extremisms. From the other side, the whole dialogical and engagement factor is, of course, highlighting affinity and inquiry. So in the early 20th century, what's called the ecumenical movement that I've alluded to posed new questions about the relationship of Christianity towards other faiths. A new approach was being sought. That really came to the fore after World War II in terms of the evolution of interreligious dialogue as a religious phenomenon, with both the Roman Catholic Church through the Vatican and the World Council of Churches emerging as key players. Certainly we can say from the mid-century, a new era of Christian-Muslim dialogue and relations was underway. The major players are, of course, firstly, the World Council of Churches, formed in 1948. It was planned during the early part of the 20th century, but World War II interrupted that. But once it was established, it quickly set up what was called a dialogue sub-unit. It later was an office, interreligious dialogue, interreligious relations, sometimes interreligious relations and dialogue. that organization goes through all sorts of changes, but the fundamental dynamic is still there. It began particularly with a study program in this whole area of dialogue with other religions, which lasted to 1971 and set the pattern. During that time, in 1960, there was a major consultation on Christian-Muslim dialogue. In it, it acknowledges the pervasive adverse effect upon Christian-Muslim relationships of long ingrained attitudes of prejudice and antagonism. In other words, that history of antipathy was recognized. But it urged Christians to approach Muslims in a spirit of respect, friendship, and common yielding to the present voice of God, mutual inquiry and affinity becoming evident. The other play, of course, as I mentioned, was the Roman Catholic Church, which in its Second Vatican Council, the first council had happened in the late 19th century, so hence this was the second. It lasted from 1962 to 1965 and convened by Pope John the 23rd. And one of the rationales for this convening was his recognition that in the post-World War II era, the Christian church needed to address questions about its relationship with other faiths and peoples of other faiths. He died during that Vatican Council period and was replaced by Pope Paul VI, who happily kept the focus and the interest in this era alive. In this context, the Secretariat for Non-Christians was formed. That was its office, if you will. It later changed its name to Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, PCID. But significantly, from the beginning, it had within it an Islam desk. So both the World Council of Churches and the Vatican had Islam as a very particular focus within a wider interest in Christian relations with other faiths. But the significant thing is, it's not until the 20th century that all this is happening that we have this very particular openness occurring. Up until that point, the default position for most Christians then, and for some is still, of course, is that Christianity is the only true religion, everything else is false. Well, many have begun to beg to differ to that assumption. Within the Vatican II, what came through that gave markers for this particular large block of Christianity was two documents. The first is what's called Lumen Gentium, Dogmatic Constitution on the Church. And significantly within that document, it affirms what's called the salvific validity of Islam, where it stated the plan of salvation also includes those who acknowledge the Creator, in the first place among whom are the Muslims. These profess to hold the faith of Abraham, and together with us, they adore the one merciful God. So that's a very strong point of recognition. In another document called Nostra Aetate, the Declaration on the Relation of the Church to Non-Christian Religions, it affirmed very clearly the Church's high regard for the Muslims. It acknowledged the many quarrels and dissensions of the past and urges that a sincere effort be made to achieve mutual understanding. Again, recognizing the history of antipathy, but looking for a future that's focused much more on affinity and inquiry. In the 1970s, you have the WCC often now working in together with the Vatican, engaging in various issues of Christian-Muslim dialogue, various events of this dialogue. And things like complementary themes were identified. On the one hand, the Christian missionary duty to evangelization, and alongside that, the Islamic imperative for da'wah. How do these two interrelate, and what do they mean? What does it mean for the different communities and how they might relate one to another? A major theme was the cooperation for the well-being of humanity. And within that, theology-related topics to emerge was the fact of the crisis of faith in the modern world, harking to the context of secularization that outside of the strictly Muslim world, of course, all faiths find themselves confronted with. The place of Jesus Christ in Islamic faith, and of course, Christian attitudes towards Muhammad. These became kind of perennial underlying religious issues in dialogue. Then you have, interesting enough, within the Roman Catholic Church, after Pope Paul VI came Pope John Paul II, and he had a long pontificate within which he engaged very, very deeply with the Muslim world. His guiding motif was the recognition of what he referred to as a spiritual bond between Christian and Muslim. And for him, the rationale for Christian-Muslim dialogue was not so much for the reconciliation of specifics of belief, nor seeking theological compatibilities, but rather the peaceful coexistence in the service of God together. So you see, in these kind of attitudes and these kind of teachings that came out, we're seeing the groundwork, the basics for ongoing, not just dialogue in terms of talking, but also for action. And I'll talk more about those kind of dynamics next week. The peaceful coexistence in the service of God together became his very much catchcry, you might say. And he alluded in that context to the religious duty of hospitality as a common heritage of both Christians and Muslims. I think that is also very significant. In addressing Muslims in the late 20th century, he made these statements: "I believe that we, Christian and Muslims, must recognize with joy the religious values that we have in common and give thanks to God for them." He also stated, "Both of us believe in one God, the only God, who is all justice and all mercy. We believe in the importance of prayer, of fasting, of almsgiving, of repentance, and of pardon. We believe that God will be a merciful judge to us at the end of time, and we hope that after resurrection, he will be satisfied with us, and we know that we will be satisfied with him." Now here it is coming from the top, if you like, from within the Christian world, from Pope John Paul II. I have to say, I wonder sometimes how many, not just Christians, not just Catholics, I should say, but Christians in general, are aware of how strong these affirmations from the Christian leadership have been. The Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue that I mentioned a wee while ago, which is the main organ within the Vatican structure for the Roman Catholic Church, had this 1994 statement in which it said the Catholic Church believes that the key dialogue is that which is carried out by Christians and Muslims who live, work, and study together in the same nation and society. All this activity of contacts, interchange, and deliberation is aimed at forming these two communities of faith who share life in so many parts of the world into becoming a force for peace and social harmony, for promoting human and divine values, and for defending the rights of the poor and voiceless. So here's the theme of an underlying theme of justice alongside harmony and peace emerging as a key dynamic in the rationale for dialogue and what it's all about. So from this kind of development through the 20th century, we come to the 21st century, and again, there are some key markers that are indicative of a new context emerging. By the late 20th century, there was a sense of a dialogue stalemate. Some people have been involved enthusiastically in the latter part of the middle part of the 20th century, began to feel that things were not going very far at all. We were going around in circles. And part of that was to do with the rise of fundamentalisms, religious fundamentalisms and others. Secular fundamentalism is as strong and as pernicious as religious fundamentalism, if you understand those terms correctly. But because underneath or with those terms is a resistance to dialogical engagement with people who are other, who are different. But then, of course, you have what we could call the 21st century watershed, September 11, 2001, commonly known just as 9/11. That led to two things. On the one hand, of course, the whole rise of the security apparatus and concern with the slogan war against terror and all that's flowed from that. On the other hand, there's also been a very strong upsurge in what we might call broad community interactions, dialogical engagements of one kind or another, so that the watershed event has sparked both, you might say, negative as well as positive reactions. But it's also heralded what we can call an era of new fascism. Hard secularism, with its antipathy to all religion, has strengthened in a number of quarters. At the same time, religious extremism or the religious right, Christian, Muslim, and others, has become much more evident and vocal. And together, of course, the assertive politics of the right. And you put all that together and you see and have experienced, and we've seen this in so many contexts, arise in deepening antipathies and putting up barriers and fences and walls rather than building bridges. And yet, building bridges has been a theme of one of the dialogical initiatives that have taken place in the 21st century. Coming out of this watershed event, in 2002, the Building Bridges seminar series was begun in the UK. And around about the same time, a Christian Muslim theological forum in Germany began. And of course, just a few years later, a common word invitation emerged very significantly from within the Muslim world. Building Bridges, as I mentioned, an Anglican initiative. It was the then Archbishop of Canterbury, the Right Reverend George Carey, who initiated and hosted the first meeting. The aim is the challenge, or to endeavour to meet the challenge, to learn from the past and to build bridges of understanding for the future. Again, picking up on those great themes I've touched on before. The event itself is meant to be non-representative. In other words, bringing together the specialists of one kind or another, ecumenical in the sense of across the spectrum of both Christian and Muslim identities and so on. Marked as an appreciative conversation and emphasizing the task of reading scriptures together, the aim of the Building Bridges seminar series is to fill a gap of a lack of opportunity for serious, reflective, and fairly loosely structured encounter between Christian and Muslim scholars. Now, the significant, very significant point to all this is that if we could say that the best that come out of the situation of Christian-Muslim engagement in the 20th century was the promotion of better communal relations, what that needs to be undergirded with is a very clear, intentional, and strong interreligious or intertheological engagement, because it's out of the theologies that the future trajectory of any kind of engagement will be either affirmed and developed or undermined and curtailed, because it all depends on theological perspectives as to whether one engages and is willing to engage or not. And as I indicated before, what we can call, broadly speaking, fundamentalists or exclusivists tend to not want to engage, whereas it takes a more liberal or open or what's called a pluralist approach to be open to that kind of engagement. The Christian Muslim Theological Forum was an initiative of young scholars, 3 young German scholars in 2002. They set the thing up. The motivation was dialogical engagement of balanced and equal nature in terms of both the level of engagement and the expertise brought to bear, similar to the Building Bridges. The goal was an academic theological dialogue in the German language, being a contribution to the common life. Now, they began kind of differently. If you like, you might say this is sort of a classic contrast, but in terms of the British way of doing things. The Building Bridges Forum began with a great fanfare in Lambeth Palace and a very, might say, top-down exercise. This began as a grassroots exercise here in Germany with these young scholars, who then, for the first 2 years, in 2003 and 2004, held exploratory Christians-only conferences in order for the Christians to come to a common understanding of what dialogue with Muslims could be about. Then they brought on Muslims on board during 2004 to form a steering group to then design and execute the actual forums themselves, which began in 2005 and have continued since as an annual conference. During these years, therefore, from the early 2000s until recently, the 2 groups, Building Bridges and the Christian Muslim Theological Forum, have engaged in a number of different topics. Some have been in common and some individual to each. So here's just some samples that focus on scripture, on prophecy, on prayer, on what the community believes is about, on issues of ethics and justice. Those ones have been in common. Interestingly, the Building Bridges program has looked at questions of humanity and of death, of science and religion, tradition and modernity. And the German one has touched on issues of identity, of suffering and pain, mission and conversion, and concepts of God. These continued, and I only just discovered today, actually, that the Building Bridges Forum, which was to take place in May of this year, has, of course, because of COVID-19, been postponed. Then a few years after these got underway, in fact, very soon after they got away, really, out of the Muslim world, out of Jordan it was, but involving a lot of Muslim scholars, in October 2007, a letter was issued, an invitation, referred to as a common word between us and you, a quotation from the Quran. This letter is in 2 sections. It has a short summary with key points. And the key phrase is this: the future of the world depends on peace between Muslims and Christians. Now just think about that for a minute. The future of the world depends on peace between Muslims and Christians. And the reason they said that was because that, and it's still the case, that despite the evidence of, well, shall we say, the inroads of secularism, secularization, the fact remains that even at a nominal level, there are more Christians and Muslims together than anybody else. So the future of the world does depend on us. So the letter says, we as Muslims invite Christians to come together with us on the basis of what is common to us, which is also what is essential to our faith and practice. In other words, again, striving to deepen affinity and join together inquiry so that we can overcome antipathy. The substantive letter is then in 3 parts. It looks at the love of God, the love of neighbor, and then addresses this invitation, come to a common word between us and you. This letter has sparked a whole raft of responses and conferences, colloquia, formal statements, so on and so forth. And there is a website, and you can go on, you can see where they've got to. But early samples include this from the Vatican, this time the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies, based in Rome, stated the supreme point of reference that undergirds the other as Judeo-Christian, namely the dual commandment of love of God and neighbor, highlighted that as being a key element in this letter of invitation. And the Commission for Religious Relations with Muslims, which is within the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, stated, the Muslim letter clearly regards the reactionary and intransigent ideologies that drive terrorism and puritanical repression are not drawing on the whole of the Islamic tradition, but rather a truncated and impoverished reading of it. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, by this stage, stated the Muslim invitation is a powerful call to dialogue and collaboration between Christians and Muslims, for which the very wide geographical and theological diversity represented among the signatories provides a unique impetus to deepen and extend the encounters. The journal called the Christian Century stated the most impressive thing about the letter is that it exists. The second most impressive thing is the economy of its argument. The scholars resist the innate desire to touch on everything pertinent to Christian-Muslim dialogue and instead invite Christians to remember Jesus' words about loving God and neighbor. That is the basis for the dialogue between us. So to conclude this little foray into the context, shall we say, and some of the developments and pointers to the exercise of Christian-Muslim engagement in the modern world, we can certainly say that there has been, since the mid-20th century, a clear expression of Christian and Muslim intention to engage, despite evidence of resistance, of detraction and criticism that abounds. There is, of course, a common intra-faith challenge. Both communities face the challenge of bringing and keeping our own faith communities on board. And the 3 initiatives that are referred to are themselves a testimony to this, as well as being or providing a resource. As the Muslim letter says, our common future is at stake. The task of dialogue remains a priority. Now, resources for what I have discussed at the moment come out from the 3 works that I've produced: The Challenge of Islam, The Church and Other Faiths, which was looked at the wider issue of interreligious dialogue, and then more recently this one, Christian Engagement with Islam, Ecumenical Journey since 1910. So that gives you a bit of background and context, and now I'm very happy to take any questions and comments on these remarks.
Professor Pratt, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. You certainly touched on some very important points there, and obviously gave us a bit of a historical timeline as to how things have developed as well. It's very important how you finished off with the sentence about the common word, how love of God and love of neighbour are primary tenets that both faith traditions can work towards. And yes, the two largest faith traditions feel somewhat responsible for the welfare of the globe. We all have a role to play, particularly those who are at the forefront of dialogue and those who are actively seeking to build bridges between the two faith traditions, but also reaching out within our own people, our own communities, in our own faith traditions, and try to get them to come along onto the journey, because it's not always an easy sell when people have that, like you said, tendency to go back to that antipathy. And that's something that we collectively are challenged by, and hopefully through our smarts on both sides, we'll be able to reach out and bring those people along for the journey. So thank you very much for that wonderful presentation, very insightful, a lot to take in. We have some questions which I'd like to present to you. First question says that, can we say that the historic decline in the followers of established religions, such as the Christian Muslim faiths, has led to increased cooperation between the followers of the Abrahamic religions?
Well, firstly, I'd challenge the sense of decline. It's really the memberships or the followers of the two faiths has been a shift. We're aware, for example, in the Christian camp, shall we say, whilst there's been certainly a decline in the secularized West, in Africa and in South America, there's been noticeable increases. And similarly, as my understanding with Islam, there's been huge, significant increases in some parts of the world, and Islam is growing. So both religions in different ways are growing, but there's certainly been shifts in population allegiances. The major question, I think, lying behind that is the context, the modern context of plurality. Now, pluralism is, if you like, an ideological perspective on a fact. Any ism is an ideology, an ity is a fact. So plurality is just a fact of diversity. Pluralism is one way of coping with that fact. If you want to reject the fact, if you want to have nothing to do with plurality, then you go down the route of exclusivism, where you deny the other. But certainly I think it's very interesting because back in the early 20th century, when I mentioned about those markers, the rise of fascism and atheistic secularism, that became one of the rallying points for the Christians, or some Christians at that point, to reach out to people of other faiths on the basis that people of faith, whatever faith, are now confronted with this rising ideology of atheistic secularism, of atheistic materialism that challenges implicitly any great faith. So Muslims and Christians had begun talking even at that point in some forms, and together with Jews as well. And of course, we saw what happened because those particular engagements weren't particularly deep or strong at that stage. And of course, the fascism at one stage rose up in a very violent way. Well, I think, I think we're seeing a similar trajectory now. But the key is actually recognizing that we need to work together because an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us.
Which sort of leads into the next question, and it's more of an observance because it's talking about the portrayal of people of faith in the media. I mean, the Muslims, obviously 9/11 was a watershed moment for them, and their portrayal of Muslims since 9/11 hasn't been savory. And more recently, it's not only recently, but Christianity to some degree has been not necessarily in the media, but in the arts with movies and the like, have sometimes been subject to ridicule. Just wanted to get your observance on the portrayal of both these faith traditions in the media, and maybe even extend that to the arts, particularly over the last few decades.
I think you've got a point there. And I'm certainly aware that in the media and in the arts generally, I mean, from an era when it was religion that inspired and is infused in so much of the art heritage of both Islam and of and of the West and of the East as well, in terms of the Christian orbit. But certainly since the rise of secularism, the whole secularist trajectory that particularly became very strong in the 20th century, religion has been seen to be not so much an inspiration for art, but an inspiration for artistic ridicule and denigration. And you know, there are certain intellect, what I call this intellectual trajectories that are very arrogant, that just simply make an assumption that anything to do with religion is just fairy tales and nonsense. And yet, what is paradoxical, two things I mentioned that's quite paradoxical, because I've come across this in terms of the media here in my own country. You get a situation where it is incredibly difficult, virtually impossible, to get the media to come along to anything that's positive about religion. But if it's negative, they'll be in like a shot. And so you see examples of that, yet at the same time, they can't help but call upon religious imagery that's deeply embedded in the culture in order to give expression. So, for example, even in the sporting realm, you have this phrase of a sporting event: David meets his Goliath. Now, if you don't know the biblical reference and the story about that, what does that mean? So I've been myself puzzled by the way in which the media downplays and denigrates religion, and yet the religious language and imagery is suffused through much of his writing. That's only one example. There's a paradox there. But the sad part about it is that so many I think of younger and contemporary journalists and others are religiously illiterate. To give you one little almost a humorous event some years ago, when we had a scholar in New Zealand and was giving a talk on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Right? Well, this was an academic exercise, but somehow the media got hold of the fact that this author was in town talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so I got rung up about these Dead Sea Scrolls. I think they got mixed up with something out of the Buddhist world, but anyhow, they said, so the question was, well, who wrote it then? Like who wrote the book? and no idea, but this sounded like this must have been something quite, whatever. So yes, I think there's a combination of deepening and concerning ignorance that I find as a religion scholar on the one hand, but also this secular antipathy to religion. So Christian and Muslims, okay, we're on the one hand, we're dealing with this history and the present expressions of antipathy that can come out from either side towards the other. At the same time, we are both being subject to antipathy from what I call secular fundamentalism. So that then becomes a common project for us both to work on. How do we combat and resist that?
Could I ask you to unpack that a little bit more, because you touched on something very important, which I was going to ask personally. Like you said, aggressive secularism seems to be, attacking both faith traditions and any faith tradition in some regards. It doesn't matter which country. And we're living in times where the individual is promoted to the fore rather than communal gatherings and the like. And you mentioned sport there, and obviously there's been a couple of incidents about a person wearing their faith on their badge and speaking up against the Israel Folau case. Muslim personalities, some of them had to change their name, or some of them are also overtly displaying their faith adherence, particularly in the AFL and NRL. There's a couple of examples that are now and that happened in the past. Just wanted to get your thoughts again on unpack that secularism and how that's a potential challenge for an individual to express themselves. So here's a person Israel Folau, who's standing up for something that he believes in, yet he's been attacked.
I know. Really,
so can you see the paradox and the irony there?
Oh yeah, totally. And I mean, and some, some pluralist secularists see the point and have made. I know there's one person, a very good journalist in New Zealand who, I would not identify with her position at all, but she made it very clear that she thought that to put Israel down and in that way was actually to deny him the freedom that in reality, she wanted to see promoted for everybody. Anyhow, no, I think coming back to the main point here is, of course, that part and parcel of the secularist philosophy or secularism is this deep stress on the individual and a downplaying of communal responsibility and identity. And we see it played out in politics incredibly strongly as well. So I think there's a paradox here, is that on the one hand, the modern era wants to affirm the individual above all else. On the other hand, if the individual expresses a religious identity, they're stomped on. That's what comes through, or ignored, or somehow that's seen to be not okay. So there has to be a challenge, I think, thrown back into the whole ideological construct that people are living by, because most people don't think about the ideology of secularism, which they're just living in and living out. And yet, there is an inconsistency there, that on the one hand, secularization that promotes the individual above the community, and yet at the same time, as soon as things happen, you turn to community. Like when Australia has its fires, it's communal support and the sense of being community and battling these things as community that comes to the fore. And as a Kiwi, I'm affronted by so much of Australian politics and policy about, for example, people they're deporting back to New Zealand who've grown up in Australia. They are existentially Australians, but because their piece of paper is not right, they're deemed to be as New Zealand citizens, and so they're hoiked home to us, and they don't know us and we don't know them. So on the one hand, we're told, oh, this is to keep Australia safe from naughty Kiwis. But as soon as the chips are down, we're all in together, we're all Anzacs. And here's a big paradox. We're all Anzacs. And where does Anzac come from? It comes from that World War I, when Australians and New Zealanders went to Gallipoli to fight Muslim caliphate who'd locked horns with, or locked in with the Germans. So it's paradoxical. Here we are in the modern world, and calling on a heritage that's all to do with Christian-Muslim relations. I mean, from a Muslim perspective, it can be seen that the Gallipoli campaign was the last skirmish of the Crusades. Here was a Christian army from outside attacking the Muslim realm. Because in those days, this wasn't modern Turkey. This was the Ottoman Empire. Modern Turkey came later. So it's curious how these contemporary questions hook back into the kind of whole context that we've been discussing. But out of it comes, I think, this needing to rethink the relationship between what it is to have individual identity and communal identity, and the relationship between them. And it'd be fair to say that in many respects, of course, while Christianity has both and Islam has both, Islam, I think, has a stronger sense of individual and community than most Christians do at the moment in the West. And that's because of the impact of the secularization process.
Thanks. I also wanted to get your thoughts on the balance between governments who are trying to sponsor these sort of initiatives. The Common Word, for example, was pretty much constructed by religious leaders at the grassroots or at the lay level. But we do see governments, whether it be a national project or whether they want to help improve relations between civilizations, are also championing or sponsoring these initiatives. What are your thoughts in striking that balance between government intervention and grassroots or like religious leader-led initiatives in trying to build that common word between the two faith traditions?
I'll be touching on some of that next week when we look at the principles, but nonetheless, though, at the moment, I'd say that I guess it's fair to say that it's not inappropriate to look twice at when a government delegation comes knocking at the door about, you know, dialogue. You sort of have to ask the question, what do they really want? You know, what's the hidden agenda? Now, there may not be a hidden agenda, and I think it is good that when governments get on board. Like, for example, there was a while, it's faded out again, because the problem with governmental one is that it's driven by the party in power, and if there's a change of party, things can change. And that happened, as you may know, with the regional interfaith dialogue forum that was Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and Indonesia, Australia, and New Zealand were at the forefront of that. And that was an annual event for a period of time and doing some good things, but change of governments, mainly when the Labor governments went out, so did that. So I think it's good if at a governmental level there can be promotion and engagement. One has to always watch out for what the underlying politics may be.
We've got an interesting one here about, and I'll read it out in full. The organised dialogue movement represents a new chapter in the long history between Muslim and Christians. Intentional efforts to understand and cooperate are hopeful signs, particularly for religious communities with a history of mutual antipathy. Muslims and Christians who advocate and engage in dialogue still face many obstacles. What are these obstacles in this century, and how can we overcome these obstacles?
The main underlying obstacle or dynamic that manifests in many different kinds of specific obstacles is religious exclusivism. And that needs to be very carefully thought through and addressed. And I've certainly been doing some work on that. And now that we've raised, I think that might be one I could build into what I'm talking about next week in a way, because it is a key principle. The principle of being open to another in order to engage implies some sense of giving recognition that the other is valid. I mean, religiously speaking, it's one thing, as has been some have done, is to say, well, let's just have dialogue and engagement on our human level. We're just human beings, and we happen to believe this or we happen to believe that. That's okay as far as it goes. But when you get to a point where people from either side or any context whose identity is deeply, deeply steeped in their religion, and whose motivations for action, whose rationale for action, whose worldview understanding is shaped by that religion, then their very sense of who they are as human beings is a religious sense. It's not that I'm a human being who happens to have a religion. That is a modernist Western perspective. But for many people, who I am is inextricably bound up with my religious identity as much as anything else. I mean, you know, religious identity is only one element of who I am. I'm also a husband, I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a brother, and I'm a Christian. But that doesn't mean to say that I can you know, I might, when I'm with my children, I'm my father, but that doesn't mean I'm not being a Christian at the same time, and vice versa. So that kind of sense of having to wear as individuals a plurality of identities, all of which are valid. Can we actually understand and accept pluralities of identities that embrace different religions? And we can engage with them as validly. That's the challenge of exclusivism, because where people say no, either between religions or even within religions. I mean, Christianity has had, well, for time immemorial, it seems, people within it who say, our version of Christianity, that's the right one, the rest of you are wrong. And you know, in both our countries, in Australia and New Zealand, we have sectarian Christian groups who form their communes or whatever, and basically shut up the doors and keep everybody out. Or groups like the Exclusive Brethren, for example, who do that. So those kind of exclusivisms are manifest and are known, and it's where they become dominant and prevalent that we have real problems. But the challenge is to actually overcome that. Firstly, to overcome it within ourselves, so that we are open to the validity of the other, and then we can engage.
And I think you mentioned that last week about being accommodating of difference and being respectful of that difference, even if it were to be difference of opinion or difference of faith creed. So it's very important. Like you said, it all starts with us. make sure that we have a more universal and holistic view to see that there is a broad spectrum out there, and even within our own faith traditions, we do see differences of opinion here and there. So
exactly.
That's the reality of the world that we live in. Professor Douglas Pratt, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for your presentation and your insight, and for answering the questions from our viewers. Join us next week again at the same time, where we will talk about, or Professor Douglas Pratt rather, will talk about principles of interfaith dialogue. And just a word that this video will be uploaded to the Pearl of the Islands Foundation YouTube, so feel free to have a look at that for this week's episode and last week's episode. So until next week, Professor Douglas Pratt, have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week, same time, for the final of the 3-part series.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.